I abandoned 2 skinny dogs to die. I still hear the sound of gravel under my tires like a verdict. I want to say it plainly, because the truth sits heavy and blunt. I left them. I tied them with a thin rope to a scraggly tree, just beyond the edge of the driveway, watched them press their ribs against the sun, and drove away. I told myself it was business expenses, reputation, the risk of disease. I told myself they were more trouble than they were worth. The voice that justified it was quiet, polite, the same voice that had negotiated leases and dismissed complaints for years. It smelled of urgency and economy and, in the end, cowardice. The place where I stopped that day was a patch of broken land between my property and the back road, all dust and scrub and the rusty shadow of a fence. The dogs, one the color of dry straw, the other a darker smudge, had once been handsome, the sort a breeder brags about in private auctions. Now their coats clung to their bodies like thin paper. Ribs showed like the seams of a poorly made garment. Their eyes were not wild so much as tired, the kind of fatigue that lives in bones after nights with nothing but hunger. I remember the rope cutting into fur, the quick knot, the small, practical motions that made the abandonment official. I remember folding the blanket out of the trunk and setting it on the passenger seat because habits die slowly. And then I remember the engine starting and the sound of my own breath in a car. That felt suddenly too small for what I'd just done. I told myself I would come back later. I had meant to do many things later that day. I know now that later was a refuge for people who do not want to be stopped in the middle of their moral inertia. If this is already hitting you, if you're sitting there wondering how someone does this, stay with me and subscribe. This is the whole story. The rest is worse and better, in ways I couldn't have predicted. I left in a hurry and expense meeting first, a dinner, then excuses to myself for why it was easier to relinquish responsibility than to face it. For a while after I drove away, I told myself I had been decisive. I convinced myself of facts. The dogs were past prime, costly to keep, competition for space with newer, more valuable animals. My voice then sounded like a ledger being closed. It sounded nothing like my voice now. What followed, in truth, is stitched together from fragments. What I remember, what people told me later, what I imagined as penance in the quiet hours. I did not witness the rescue. I cannot claim to have been there at the untying, but the story of that afternoon of a man who should have been invisible, doing what the rest of us refused, has lived inside me like a splinter. I only saw the consequences, the aftershock that returned to me when I least expected it. I will not pretend to have been a witness to his first hand, but the memory of his actions shaped the rest of my life enough that I can feel, in my chest, the small things, the scrape of sandpaper palms, the clink of a tin can, the muffled bark that turned into a wheeze and then, slowly, into the sound of a dog remembering how to be a dog. The beggar who found them call him Miguel, though that isn't his legal name. And I do not know if he had one that mattered then, was the sort of man you taught your children to look away from. He was small in stature in the way the world had made him small, but there was a steadiness to him that did not belong to pavement or the immediate calculus of passersby. When someone told me about him later, they used the word worn as if that explained everything. Worn does not explain gentleness. Worn does not explain the way he cupped water in his hands and offered it like a priest holding out a sacrament. He heard them first, a faint, regular sound under the wind, a whimper that was not loud enough to command attention. The sort of animal noise people pass as background until it becomes impossible to ignore. He followed that sound, past the thorn bushes and the tin can that had been his home for months, and he found the two of them trembling and tied and trying to fold themselves thin enough that the sun would forget them. What he did next is the image I keep returning to, a man with nothing much at all kneeling in the dust, humbling himself not to a man but to an animal. He tipped a bottle of water into his cupped hands and held it out. He split a small, stale piece of bread with his fingers and pushed it towards a muzzle as if he were offering a chalice. The dogs, for their part, were cautious. At first, trust is expensive when you've lost everything, but hunger is plain commerce, and hunger makes small deals with strangers. He did not wake anyone. He did not list possessions to see what he could trade. He simply started to unfasten the knots. His hands were patient and deliberate. He worked as if he had time to spare, as if he believed the day could be spent righting a wrong. I picture him whispering to them, not with the clumsy language of heroism, but in the soft, practical phrases of someone preventing further harm. Hold. Take it. Come. He fashioned leashes from scraps of string and an old belt and strapped them into a makeshift shoulder harness to carry the smallest one. He lifted like he had learned to move with care, because he had to, because everything he did had to preserve what little he was leaving himself to keep. They walked slowly. Every step was a negotiation. The dogs did not have the strength for a swift escape or the fight for survival that someone younger might assume. They went because someone else insisted they could. He carried them as one carries a child that must be trusted not to fall. The night that followed at the corner where he slept was a vigil, not a performance. He wrapped an old coat around them and sat until the stars wheeled overhead and the sounds of the city softened. He kept watch. He tilted his head to listen for breathing. He pressed his palm to a flank, feeling for the tiny, stubborn heat that means life is still fighting. Somebody later, someone at a small clinic would say his hands smelled like soup and dust and the faint sweetness of cigarettes. I am telling you this not because a detail like scent redeems anything. It doesn't. I say it because it is human, and the human is the point. A retired veterinarian named Elena Gen, a placeholder. The truth is, she had a reputation in town for taking in what others declared law. Saw him come into her clinic. He arrived with 2 ragged animals swaddled in blankets, one under his arm, the other limping at his heels. She recognized, beneath the neglect and the filth, the lines of breeding, the right shoulder, a clipped ear here, a trait there. She took them, as any professional takes what requires tending, with a quick assessment, a plan, and a refusal to romanticize the work. Her clinic smelled of antiseptic and something softer. Old books, boiled bones, the particular scent of a place where people convene to fix what can be fixed. Elena moved through the space like someone who took responsibility seriously and believed in small miracles made of steady hands. She examined them, palpated hearts and stomachs, with the efficiency of someone who knows there are limits. She did not promise miracles. She did not say they would be exquisite or whole. She promised to try. The dogs were given a warm place to sleep on a sheet that had seen better days. They were fed small, measured portions nutrition that had to be introduced back into a body that had grown suspicious of abundance. Antibiotics, fluids, a slow progression of care, and there was the work that medicine alone cannot do. Someone sitting with them. Miguel sat. He refused to be pushed aside. He slept on a chair in the corner and woke at every small sound. He wiped their noses with the same careful motion over and over, as if the repetition itself were a prayer. A trainer came by the clinic, someone who volunteered with a local foundation that promoted humane adoption and skillful care. She bent close to the darker dog and held the small of his jaw and said, "You're safe." It was such a simple sentence, but the way it was delivered had the authority of both truth and intention. The lighter dog trembled and then rested a head on the trainer's palm. The connection was not instantaneous or cinematic. It was slow and messy and weighted with needs. But every little positive reinforcement food placed in the hand, the soft click of a treat added layers to a fragile trust. That trainer saw more than the animals. She saw the man in the corner, the patience in his hands, the way he would rise to help with a bandage, the low, firm tone he used when coaxing a trembling muzzle. She listened when he told her, in a voice that rushes when someone unburdens themselves, that he could not take them to his usual places because people shooed him away, that he had a place on the street where he could sleep if it was a dry night, but no one offered food unless they had room in their pockets and their soft days. She looked at him as one human looks at another, and, perhaps because she had been a stranger once to fear and disdain, decided to do something that changed the rest of our lives. The foundation offered what it could. Space in a small volunteer shelter, temporary funding for medical bills, an intake assessment. They didn't make grand pronouncements. They moved with the constrained optimism of people who know resources are finite and compassion practical. They offered training sessions, a slow rehabilitation program that thought ahead to adoption events and to the dog's long-term needs. The dogs, as it turned out, were the kind that respond quickly to structure Their bodies remembered movement and their eyes remembered human expectation, not cruelty, but direction. The more consistent the care, the more the thin bones filled out. First came the tentative wagwan tail that could not quite commit to joy. Then came the sound of a dog finding his voice. A long exhalation bark that grew stronger with each passing week. Their recovery was neither miraculous nor quick. It was the product of medicines, rest, patience, and someone who sat with them when pain made withdrawal the tempting path. Meanwhile, word had a way of moving slow gossip made fast in small town circuits. A neighbor of mine, a woman who oversaw a part of a local charity, bumped into the trainer at a market. She mentioned the 2 dogs and the man who had saved them. A coworker at one of my properties texted a grainy photo taken from a distance. The 2 dogs at a local fair, standing taller than their frames had done in months, their coats catching the light. Another text contained a short video of the dogs performing a basic set of commands, clean and precise, the trainer's voice calm in the background. None of it was intended for me. None of it was an invitation. When I first saw that blurry video, my chest tightened in an odd way. It was not righteous fury or guilt alone. It was something colder at the start. Ownership pricked like a small, practical wound. I thought about value, about the way animals, especially pedigreed ones, carry market worth as easily as names carry social currency. I imagined the price they might fetch if I reclaimed them. Repaired, rebranded, I told myself the right thing, which was that I could simply reclaim them, pay the bills, and continue. I told myself there would be a cost, but that the cost would be trivial to me. But the facts had altered. The clinic had records. Elena, who had seen them in a state that admits no pretense, recognized them for what they were. Not just animals but living beings with provenance. She saw, too, what happened when someone without social standing devoted attention to the daily rituals of care. She saw the dogs lean into hands that smelled of street smoke and kindness. She saw the way the beggar Miguel moved with a quiet authority around them. She testified to that in quiet professional ways, to the foundation people and, later, to others who asked. There was a moment when my absolute right to those dogs, my paperwork, my bills, my ownership bumped against a different kind of claim. The claim was not legal at first. It was moral and public. People began to take interest, not because their hearts had been pierced by the spectacle of stray animals, but because the narrative was delicious in a way towns hunger for, a humble man saving pedigreed dogs abandoned by a wealthy owner. The narrative did not need me to act to find its meaning. It grew around him. I returned to the area once, because curiosity and a stubborn instinct to reassert control pulled me back. I drove very slowly past the place where I had left them and found only the impression of a blanket and a bent twig. That sight sank a nail of shame deep into my side. I stopped by Elena's clinic on purpose the next week under the pretense of volunteering some funds. She greeted me with a sort of professional courtesy that was both blade and balm. Precise, slightly cool, not hiding the fact that she had seen what neglect looks like. Inside the clinic, under a harsh examination lamp that turned fur into something almost luminous, I saw them. Seeing is such a small verb for something that rearranged me from the inside out. They did not look like property. They did not look like commodities to be returned. They looked like the result of care. Ears perked, eyes clear, fur starting to close over the ribs that had once mapped out survival. Miguel was there, his coat patched but clean, his hands steady. He handled them without the possessiveness I had expected. He fed them with the same measured motions he used in the street. No flourish, no show. He spoke to them low and practical things about staying and walking and eating. He had a way of referring to them that sounded like names. Not marketing tags, but personal calls. When I approached, I felt the color drain from my face, as if I had stepped outside of time. I had intended to speak first, to demand my due, to make a case that what was mine should be returned. There were legal forms I could fill out. There were receipts and breeder papers. I had power. But the presence of that man with the dogs, a figure who had the audacity to care without asking, was an argument not in contract law, but in community. Elena introduced us with a tone that avoided conflation. He found them, she said. He brought them here, he's cared for them. There was no flourish, just the plain fact. I remember feeling a small, irrational urge to justify my absence, to explain what had been going on in my head that led me to believe abandoning them was acceptable. The excuses tasted like cold metal in my mouth. There was a paper trail, of course, medical logs, intake forms, the Foundation's notes. They had recorded McGill as the person who brought them in, the one who sought care. The Foundation had placed the dogs under their temporary stewardship pending owner claims, adoption checks, and possible rehabilitation. Procedural language became armor for people who wanted to do the right thing in the right way. For a moment, I had to grapple not only with my moral failing but with how the town would read it. A wealthy owner deserts prized animals. A man with nothing rescues them. The community chooses dignity over property. I cannot say the choice was unanimous. There were people who whispered about ownership rights, who murmured about legalities and compensation. There were business partners who sent curt messages asking awkwardly about optics. A contractor who had once courted my favor returned a contract late, citing delays. People are rarely bold enough to stand in the harsh light of moral clarity when it comes to someone else's reputation. They choose convenience. Yet the momentum of the story of the dogs, of McGill, of a clinic that refused to erase the evidence of compassion began to push back. To take them back, I would need to be more than a man with papers. I would need to be a man with a narrative that could drown out the one people had already settled into. I could have tried legal routes. I could have launched an argument that property rights trumped informal claims. But any legal maneuver would have required me to continue to justify my original choice either to the court of law or the court of public opinion. And I could feel, finally, how weak that justification was. So I did what men like me do first. I tried to barter with the appearance of contrition. I offered to cover the bills, to pay the Foundation, to donate to the clinic. I wrote checks that, in retrospect, felt like bandages on a wound that needed amputation. I sent messages that sounded like remorse. I hired, for a short while, someone to manage the crisis of reputation. Polite language and charitable sums were used as stopgaps. It bought me time, but time was not what I needed. What I needed was a writing that money could not buy. Outside of all the formalities, something else was changing, and it was harder to paper over. Miguel began to be seen not as a footnote in a drama where I had been the protagonist, but as a central figure. He began, as the weeks unfolded, to move out of the margins. The trainer arranged for him to be at the shelter, first as a volunteer feeding and walking the animals, then as the dogs improved. As someone who understood them in a way that training manuals did not capture, the Foundation offered him a small stipend to help cover basics. Elena lobbied quietly for him to be a candidate for custodial work at the clinic, someone honest, reliable, and with proven devotion. No one made a spectacle of offering him dignity. The offers came as simple propositions: help with housing paperwork, a chance to learn formally, a role where he could be accountable and have a paycheck. The community's reaction was complicated. Some people applauded. Neighbors brought donated blankets. A few small donors contributed to the clinic's fund earmarked for the dogs. Others watched with suspicion, as if the entire thing were an affectation. But one can see change in small, undeniable moments. A woman who used to ignore him stopped and asked him his name. A child asked the trainer if he could meet the man who saved the dogs. Miguel, for his part, did not gloat. He accepted the offers with a certain incredulous humility. He kept his hands busy. He learned how to write his name properly on the clinic's log. He kept his eyes on the dogs. I watched from a distance initially. Later, I watched with more direct involvement as my attempts at reclaiming them became less about retrieval and more about reckoning. I had not expected the public to side with a man who had been made small. I had not expected the force of simple, persistent care to outdo the strength of paperwork. I had not anticipated the way my own conscience, once nudged, would become a newer kind of tribunal. There was one afternoon I will never forget. The Foundation hosted a small, evented demonstration of the progress the dogs had made. It was not a parade. It was a modest display in a community hall. Chairs set in folding rows, coffee in a cheap urn, people who care enough to show up. The dogs walked through basic commands. Tails high, eyes bright. The trainer called out their names with a soft pride. There was applause, not thunderous, but genuine. Miguel stood near the back with the coat he had used to wrap them in the beginning. Someone had bought him a new jacket. It fit him awkwardly, as if dignity is not yet used to the clothes it is given. When the trainer gestured for him to come forward, people made room, as he stood with them, and I watched, standing near the doorway. Feeling like an eavesdropper to my own life, I saw an economy flip. Here was a man who had been dismissed by polite society, now the hinge on which a story of rescue turned. His voice was low and measured as he accepted the clapping. He did not look at me. He did not need to. The dogs leapt up toward him with an affection that rocket-struck any rationale I had about ownership and value. The announcer mentioned the clinic and the foundation and the work of volunteers. Small, factual praises that did not need to hide the complexity of what had occurred. I left that day with a new kind of weight. It was not the sharp sting of legal peril. It was the dull, persistent pain of conscience. My phone rang with curt messages from associates who had seen photographs. A partner postponed a meeting that had been important to a development we were planning. A supplier asked politely about the situation and delayed shipments. Reputation, which I had treated as a negotiable asset, had begun to evaporate into a fog of doubt. I could feel my standing as easily as a man might feel the erosion of property when a river changes course. There were no flames, no hiss of scandal, just the slow, remorseless unmooring of favor. I sat in my car for a long time afterwards, thinking in that particular way that men who are used to controlling outcomes do. I calculated, evaluated, considered the cost-benefit of every possible move. Buy them back. Pay off the foundation. Public apology? Private restitution? Each option felt like a script written by someone else. Each seemed to dodge the real need, which was for me to be smaller and truer. That was not a transaction I had learned how to do. All my business acumen did little against the rawness of shame. And yet this is the strange and honest part. I began to see, with the slow, clarifying light of discomfort, that the act of leaving the dogs had started a chain in which I lost more than I thought I had the right to defend. The man I had once dismissed had been the instrument of a different kind of economy, one that exchanged neglect for care, invisibility for recognition, a life spent on the margins for a chance at steadiness. He had offered what I had, not steadfastness. In return, life offered him something I could never purchase. The social personhood that communities grant when they watch someone choose the vulnerable and perform dignity in public. I had been the catalyst of harm. He had been, unintentionally, perhaps, the catalyst of repair. Both facts flattened me in ways I could not have measured before. There was no legal whitewash for the moral debt I owed. Paper and money could settle bills, but not the calluses forming on my conscience. The story does not end there. By the time the dogs were fit enough for a public showcase, something the trainer and the foundation planned as a demonstration of rehabilitation, I had to decide whether to step back into the light I had created or to remain a figure in the margins. Learning what it felt like to be judged, I could feel community eyes on me like weather. I had a choice: proceed with a claim that would be met with resistance, or accept the lesser penalty of being diminished to a cautionary tale. I walked toward the clinic the afternoon. The trainer called me and said, plain and direct, "If you want to talk, come by. If not, stay away." The simplicity of that invitation struck me. It was not a summons to battle. It was an offer to speak, to be heard. As I pushed open the clinic door, the light fell differently than it had on the day I first brought them. The same lamp turned the fur into a living thing. Miguel looked up from a logbook, and the dogs shifted at the sound of my steps. Everything that was to follow the confrontation, the legal tangle, the slow reconstruction of my sense of self, or the lack of it, compressed into that small moment when our gazes met across a table that had seen many hands. He did not stand when I entered. He nodded. He did not flinch when I approached. That gesture was not necessarily forgiveness, but it was more than arrogance deserved. In the corner, Elena moved with the quiet competence that had first intervened in their lives. The trainer lingered in the doorway, as if to signal that this was not her stage. "You're here," Miguel said, his voice the same steady thing it had always been. There was no confession in it. There was no triumph either. There was a simple notice of fact. I opened my mouth to speak and found the sentence that had been rehearsed in the car earlier: my attempts at restitution, offers of money, the procedural claims, and none of them felt like the right currency. The dogs lifted their heads and watched us, and in their eyes I saw two lives that no longer belonged solely to contracts or to mine. The door to the clinic opened then, and someone outside shouted the name of a reporter, a local volunteer with a camera for a community channel, out that the rehabilitation showcase would begin in a few minutes. Chairs were being set, the hall filled with people who cared enough to be there. The moment thinned and sharpened toward consequence. I stood there in that narrow fall of attention, uncertain which of my old instincts to trust, the instinct to reclaim, to take back what I had lost in a different way, or the instinct to finally face the tally of what my actions cost, and to accept a new, smaller account of myself. It was a moral dilemma dressed in the plain clothes of a choice. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray, and the light on the dog's fur was soft like an apology that had been given and not yet accepted. I had to decide, in the seconds between footsteps in the corridor, whether I would be the man who re-enters to take or the man who stays to repair. The choice felt larger than me. It felt like the hinge upon which my remaining dignity turned. I stepped forward. Miguel looked at me for a long second, and in that small measure of time I could feel every ledger entry I had ever made fall silent. My rehearsed lines: office to pay, to cover expenses, to make amends on paper, stayed lodged in my throat like a coin that would not slip out. The dogs watched us both, heads cocked, as if they could read the accounting of two men and find only a single, simple truth. They had been saved by one of us, abandoned by the other. I shouldn't have left them, I heard myself say before I could edit the sentence into the cleaner phrasing I usually preferred. The words were raw and clumsy. Miguel did not respond with anger, nor with a congratulatory forgiveness. He only let the silence sit where words might have gone, and kept his hands busy with a pen and the clinic logbook. Elena watched me like a judge who had been practicing mercy for years. She had seen too many different sorts of human failure to be startled by mine, but she did not let me off some cheap, emotional charge. Her mien read, "Do better, or do not pretend to." There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no vindictive townsfolk dragging me through the mud. The consequences were quieter, and for me they were harsher because they were precisely the sort of things I had spent most of my life avoiding: being known. My phone ceased to be a shield. Partners who had once accepted my polish now asked for meetings that were shorter and colder. A contractor declined to work with my company until matters settled. Invitations I had grown used to stopped arriving. Business is mostly about reputations, and reputations are thin, things that tear when the wrong hands pull on them. People shifted away in small, practical ways that did not require spectacle. A delayed contract, a polite but firm decline, a text that left no room for reply. That slow, steady retraction hurt because it stripped away the safety net that had allowed me to make the kind of choice I had made. But the community's reaction also contained another current. People were not merely curious. Many were quietly proud of what had happened. They found something right in the story of a man with nothing who chose to spend what little he had on someone else. The narrative that odd, insistent thing towns produce leaned toward dignity. It did not absolve me. Instead, it made clearer the choice I had failed to make and the alternative that had prevailed. At first, I tried to fix the outward problem with outward solutions. I delivered a check to the clinic. I wired funds to the foundation. I had lunch with Elena and told her, in the polite language of penance, that I wanted to help more. She accepted the money without ceremony and then told me, very plainly, that money might buy medicine and supplies but could not replace the work of presence. Money is a tool, she said. It is not a moral witness. The sting in that sentence was so precise because it spelled what I had attempted to avoid, that true repair asks for involvement, not just payment. The foundation, for their part, set procedures in motion. They were scrupulous in a way that made me uncomfortable and, oddly, grateful. The dogs were under temporary care. Decisions about permanent guardianship would be guided by welfare assessments, by best practices, by the dog's own well-being. Legal forms existed, yes, but they were overlaid with professional standards, who had provided sustained care, Who had the capacity to guarantee that care? What environment best served the animal's needs? The process was methodical. It was not about punishment, but about protecting the living creatures who had no voice in my dispute over property. There was a public element, too, which I had underestimated. The small video clips and photos that had floated around the town had found their way into an online community channel and been shared by volunteers. People began to recognize Miguel not as a stereotype but as a person who had done something rare under ordinary conditions. A neighbor who had always passed him without notice stopped him in line at a store and asked if he was receiving help. A local volunteer offered to help with housing forms. A trainer who ran workshops for volunteers insisted Miguel complete her program, saying he had an instinct most people could learn a lifetime to reveal. These changes did not come as charity in the humiliating sense. They came because people began to see Miguel as an agent, someone whose action had created measurable results. He had the quiet authority of one who had practiced care for weeks, when the rest of us had merely debated it in conference rooms. Offers were made in the plain terms of work and learning, a part-time role at the shelter, training hours, assistance with an identification card. He received a small stipend. He was introduced to others who could help him with basic paperwork. People gave him things that mattered. A place to wash, a place to sleep that was not a tin can on the curb, helped to enroll in a program that taught animal care and basic literacy. The dignity in those transactions was not sentimental. It was practical and slow. The kind of dignity you build with a steady hand and a calendar marked by small, regular appointments. Watching that unfold, I realized the dogged truth that had always been hiding in the thin ledger of my life. Compassion has an economy of its own, and it produces social currency that cannot be purchased. It creates obligations, relationships, and a chain of favors that are not about gratitude, but about mutual dependence. The man I had left behind, the one people used to look past, became central to a new network of care. He received a stable role at the clinic as a caretaker and handler under supervision, in part because he had already proven himself to be trustworthy with lives that required nothing less. The dogs, too, took a path that surprised me. Under Elena's steady hand and the trainer's patient sessions, they learned to move through the world without the constant tremor of readiness. Their bodies recovered slowly, and their powers of affection increased not in some sentimental arc but through the daily mechanics of being fed, stroked, prompted with a command, then rewarded. They became known around town as ambassadors for the shelter's rehabilitation program. Examples: that simple, consistent care could restore both body and behavior. At small charity events they performed basic routines, and people who had once shrugged at their photos now smiled when they saw them in person. The darker dog was particularly steady. He would lean against Miguel in a way that belonged to a pair who had survived together, as if to say, "We remember who saved us." Time, the slowest of teachers, did something else as well. It taught me how to be seen. I began, awkwardly and without fanfare, to show up. My first visits to the clinic were clumsy acts of atonement. I scrubbed floors. I sat in the waiting room and took calls that were not about property. I learned how to clean kennels and how to hold a leash without doing what I used to do: command and expect. There was humiliation in this. There was also learning. Miguel watched me, perhaps with a curious steadiness. Sometimes he spoke to me, not with accusation, but with questions that required real answers. Will you keep coming? Will you help with the bills regularly, or only when it is convenient? Will you tell the truth right away when something is wrong? Those questions had the economy of people who had practiced saving lives. They were blunt and honest. I found I could not always answer them, at least not fully, but I could keep one promise: to be present. Presence did not redeem me overnight. People were not quick to forget the fact that I had chosen convenience over cost. An associate who had once courted our deals declined further work. A development stalled because a partner rescinded a handshake. Invitations shrank. But there were small reparations that mattered more than social standing. Elena allowed me to help administer medicine. The trainer showed me how to reward a behavior without demanding obedience. Miguel, in that slow way that is the opposite of the dramatized conversion we tell ourselves we desire, taught me to be patient with progress. He could be quiet and unremarkable in moments, and that, strangely, was a virtue. He never sought to rub my nose in my error. He simply kept accounts of care in the clinic log and did the work. The human world rearranged itself. The dogs became fixtures at educational outreach days. They visited schools under supervision, teaching children about responsibility. Their recovery was used by the foundation to argue for programs that support not only animals but people in precarious positions who care for them. People who had once ignored the problem of street animals now brought blankets and food to the shelter. The little ripple that began with a man bending to scoop water into cupped hands grew into a modest current of community responsibility. And yet, my own internal ledger required a different accounting. The town's decision, informal but decisive to side with the sustained caregiver over the absent owner, forced me to reassess more than property lines. There were conversations, formal and informal, that made the point clear. Legal rights are not always moral rights, and the system that values paper over practice can be mobilized to protect living beings. I could have pursued legal avenues, claims, counsel, arguments about ownership, but every time I pictured those motions, I saw Miguel's hands and the dog's eyes, and the motions looked increasingly untenable. Even if law could have restored the animals to me, what would possession mean? Would I be the man who had abandoned them once and now reclaimed them as prizes? That line of thought held little appeal. The town's verdict, such as it was, mattered more. Care had been done, and it had costs and consequences beyond monetary terms. There was a small hearing of sorts when the foundation formalized custody into a stewardship agreement. It was not a courthouse spectacle, no cameras, no grand pronouncements, but a gathering of people who had to determine where the dog's best interests would be served. Elena, the trainer, representatives from the foundation, and a social worker sat across from me and asked me practical questions. What was my capacity to provide stable care? How would I ensure continued veterinary attention? What arrangements would exist for emergencies? I answered, honestly, that my previous pattern showed a failure of commitment. My schedules and priorities had not aligned with living things that required constant attention. To my credit, I admitted it. To my humiliation, the admission was not a legal plea that would win the case automatically. It was a human confession that shifted the conversation away from a cold transaction and toward long-term welfare. They assigned the dogs to long-term rehabilitation under the foundation, with Miguel designated as primary caregiver in partnership with the clinic. The decision was not framed as punitive. It was a deliberate move to ensure the dogs would continue to live in an environment that had already proved beneficial. For me, it was a public acknowledgement that my actions had failed the moral test, and that restitution might look like different forms of engagement rather than reclaiming ownership. I signed the paperwork. It felt like an odd liberation, to surrender formally to a better outcome for those I had wronged. Losing the dogs in that specific, literal sense cost me something I had once counted as central: the control to decide. Losing it, however, taught me the more difficult lesson of letting go. I started to understand that some debts are not repaid with money, but with a lifetime reach. My days grew differently. When I had once scheduled meetings and closed deals, I began arranging my calendar around shifts at the clinic. I learned to accept small tasks, a kind of menial work that people used to equate with humility. I cleaned kennels. I walked dogs. I sat with animals in need. These acts did not erase my past. They merely changed the texture of my present. Miguel's life changed in ways that were both practical and subtle. He was offered a more formal position, caretaker and handler at the clinic, with training, support, and help converting a temporary shelter into something more stable. He received a small stipend that rose with experience. He got assistance filling out applications for housing and for basic healthcare. People who had once avoided him now stopped to talk, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with admiration. He never sought the spotlight. He accepted the offers with his steady, small gratitude, not performative, not exploitative. Just the posture of someone who had been offered exit from precarity and chose to walk through it. The dogs had their own trajectory. They were trained for public visits and therapy outreach, and they responded to the structure. The trainer worked them into routines that suited their temperaments. They became familiar faces at events, advocating for responsible pet ownership and rehabilitation programs. Their success in these public capacities was not a glittering rise to fame. It was a series of small successes that translated into regular support for the foundation, a modest increase in donations, a few new volunteers, a couple of grants that allowed the clinic to expand its intake program. The animals' rehabilitation turned into a model used to argue for funding for similar efforts elsewhere. Sitting in on some of the foundation's talks, I watched Miguel speak once to a small group about what it was like to find the dogs. He was quiet at first. Then he told the story simply. The whimper under the wind. The hands cupping water. The knots unfastened. He did not make himself the hero. He simply told the truth of his day, and that truth, given without flourish, landed in people the way a rock makes concentric circles in a still pond. Children in the audience later wrote letters. A local business donated food supplies based on his account. A volunteer program added an outreach shift to bring supplies to neighborhoods where people struggled to tend pets. For me, watching that was both a relief and a continued chest. There was an irony I could not escape. The man I had once written off as invisible had become the visible center of a movement I had inadvertently started. I had created the problem. He had created the repair. That inversion of fate was a form of justice that neither sensationalized me nor punished him. It simply rewired our lives around what had actually happened. There were moments, many of them, that tested the sincerity of my change. An old associate reached out to propose a deal contingent on me keeping a low profile about the dogs. I declined, not from cleverness but from a new internal grammar. I did not want to negotiate moral failing for strategic advantage. When clients asked awkward questions, I did not hide. I said, plainly, that I had made a terrible choice and was trying to repair it. Some people accepted that, others did not. The cost to my business was tangible. The gain to my conscience, if such a thing can be tallied, was less easily measured but no less real. Over months, the rhythm of my life settled into something that felt like restitution by habit rather than by show. I learned, among other things, that doing small things well can be a form of penance and progress. I learned how to carry a new kind of humility without turning it into vanity. Miguel taught me, indirectly, to measure people by the steadiness of their actions rather than the loudness of their words. The community's regard for him became part of the town's narrative. Local schools invited him to speak. Volunteers sought to learn from his approach, which combined no formal training at first, but a kind of honesty and consistency that could be taught, and it was the Foundation's program to help people in precarious situations who cared for animals gain traction. They argued persuasively for the logic that helping caregivers prevents larger crises, families keep pets, animals stay healthier, and the marginalization that makes abandonment possible is addressed in practical terms. There was a day, some months later, when the trainer called and asked if I would attend a modest ceremony. It would not be about me, she warned, but about the dogs and the program. I went, partly because I had learned to show up, partly because I wanted to see what had become of the pair I had left behind. The room was modestes, a banner, warm beverages and filled with the people who had done the work, volunteers, clinic staff, a handful of donors. The dogs walked in, steady and proud, tails swishing with a kind of professional calm that comes from training and feeling appreciated. Miguel stood with them, wearing the jacket someone had bought him, and when he spoke, his voice was plain and clear. He thanked the volunteers. He muttered, almost in passing, that he had been given a chance. He did not mention me. He did not need to. The applause was genuine and earned. I remember the light that afternoon, warm and low, the kind that settles over a town like a benediction. I thought then of the gravel under my tires, which had started this. I thought of the rope cutting into fur. I thought of the small, decisive gesture of a man cupping water and bread when he could have kept walking. The image of Miguel's hands, small and patient, remained with me as a compass. It pointed towards something I had not had before, a way to live that required me to be accountable in the presence of others. What did I lose? Materially, perhaps a little business paused, contracts delayed. Socially, a comfortable seat at certain tables was taken away. But what I gained, and this is the harder truth to name, was a clearer moral center. There is no neatly tied redemption story where I am simply forgiven and everything returns to place. Ima sequence pacisto. I still feel the weight of that desertion when I drive past the scrubland where I left them. The gravel still sounds like a verdict. But the sound has different resonance now. It is a reminder, not merely an indictment. When people ask me what I learned from this neighbor's volunteers, sometimes in late-night conversations with the trainer I tell them this: cruelty is easy because it is efficient. Compassion is harder because it is slow. Compassion demands daily accounting, patience, a tolerance for unglamorous labor, and often, compassion is offered by those we least expect to give it. The irony of the whole thing is that the man society had taught me to see as less than taught me how to be more. Miguel's fate changed in the most human ways. Steady work, a modest income, help finding stable housing, and a place in a community that looked out for him. He did not become rich. He did not become famous. He became visible. That visibility allowed him to remake the small scaffolding of life that most of us take for granted on a dress. A schedule, a role that matters. The dogs, for their part, became living testimonies in a quiet campaign that animals abandoned can be healed, that people on the margins can be agents of rescue, that community care yields measurable results. As for me, the fate that was changed was less visible, but no less consequential. I lost a certain arrogance and, slowly, learned the expensive art of humility. My work with the clinic continued. I found it harder to speak in the old confident tones. I learned instead to be factual, useful, and present. I did not expect gratitude. If it came, I accepted it with more awkwardness than I would have liked. If it did not, I continued. There is a particular kind of quiet satisfaction in folding towels for animals whose names you do not own, in refilling food bowls, in learning the schedule of a place where life is mended rather than sold. It is a rhythm that cannot be bought with money or purchased with status. It is, instead, something you earn by showing up day after day. The story that began with a decision to abandon ended, finally, with a series of decisions to repair. Those decisions did not undo the past. They constructed a future where the people who had been harmed by machismos, directly the dogs and, in part, myself, found a kind of restitution that was real because it was built on continued care. Miguel's life improved not because I wrote a big check but because a community recognized that dignity is something to be built together, through policies and programs and, at the smallest level, daily acts. If there is a final image I carry, it is of the same road where I once left them, seen now, at dawn. The sun is a thin coin on the horizon, dust-lit gold. The tree where I tied that knot stands unremarkable, its branches leaning into the morning as if nothing significant had ever happened there. But underneath that ordinary scene, I hear the memory of a man's hands cupping water. I hear the quiet that followed my car, tires, and the small, noisy life that returned to two dogs because someone bent down to do what I would not. The gravel still sounds under tires when I drive, but now the noise calls not only shame, but instruction. To look, to act, to be accountable. I tell this story because the choice I made was mine, and the consequences are mine to bear. I confess it because confession is the first step toward repair. I tell you about Miguel not to elevate him into an icon, but to show how ordinary acts of compassion can redirect lives that seemed, in one moment, destined for erasure. The world is neither fair nor simple, but it is malleable when people act. If this moved you, if it unsettled you, if it made you think of the animals in your neighborhood or the people we pass without seeing, share this story. Consider supporting your local animal rescue or volunteering. Small, steady care changes lives. It changed mine. It changed his. It changed theirs. It can change yours, too.